Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Arnold, and I'm the Extension Agent here in Buncombe County, and will be your host today. We'll make time throughout the talk to answer as many questions as we can. I'm sure we have a lot to cover, so we'll do the best we can. We're going to make we are recording this, and we're going to make a PDF of the Luke's presentation. And we'll send that out along with a rough cut of the video after our program in the next couple of days. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Gardening in the Mountains, Right Plant, Right Place. Our speaker today is Luke Owen. Luke got his start into horticulture growing up on a small family farm in Western. Buddy. Thank you, Luke.
Yeah,